talk about, and I haven't touched on it very much, but if you strip away the dogma and look at the practices from all these religious and spiritual approaches, they fall into three basic categories. There's the basic engineering, so change your diet. It's in the Vedic tradition, it's hinted at in other traditions. Natural diet, fruit. It's even, like I say, hinted at in the Sumerian story of Adam and Eve, fruit, whatever. Then techniques to inhibit the left hemisphere. So, for example, the Trappist tradition, the kind of the approaches where you don't speak for a long time. The left hemisphere is so dependent on speech. That's all it has. If you stop speaking, it kind of starts shutting itself down. That's why most of us gabble and chatter all the time to fill the gap. So we have a voice in our head that never bloody shuts up. And again, most people here probably have that going on. And we wouldn't share the contents of that chattering with our closest friends. It's so crazy. And yet we're all doing it. We won't own up to doing it. So techniques to shut the left hemisphere down. That can also include sleep deprivation, because I didn't actually explain that. I think the hemispheres have different batteries. One very powerful but not in charge. One very weak but in charge. So you stay awake, the left hemisphere gets tired more quickly. That's why we become more emotional when we're tired. We tend to socialize more in the evening when the left hemisphere is tired. Eventually it's like, right, I've had enough, I'm going to bed. And that's what we do. But if you stay awake, its batteries run down, it gets irritable, speech slurs, you get clumsy, doesn't like it, but it also starts to lose control. And if you keep that process going long enough, it eventually has no choice but to let through right hemisphere perception and function. Hence it's a part of vision quest, for example, classic sort of American tradition where you'd stay awake for 4 or 5 days till you got into a visionary state, not a verbal state, not a conceptual state, but visual, which is right hemisphere. It's in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the last challenges for the initiate to reach the altered or the lost state of the ancestors was stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. It's implied in the Buddhist tradition. Prolonged meditation is sleep deprivation. If you're not falling asleep, you're staying awake. Well, the Buddha meditated for 7 days and nights. That's the myth. I don't know if it's true or not, but it's there in the kind of traditions. So techniques to inhibit the left hemisphere. And then the other category is techniques to stimulate the right hemisphere. So that would include, we've already hinted at it. There's obviously chemical traditions. People have found chemicals that will specifically stimulate the right hemisphere. So I'm not talking about cocaine. That tends to exaggerate the ego, the left hemisphere. I'm talking about the expansive chemicals that tend to stimulate the right hemisphere. Singing, complex dance and music. So I'm not talking about simple beat, simple rhythm. The left hemisphere can manage that, but there's much more complex rhythm and movement. Left hemisphere is frightened of it, doesn't want to do it, can't do it. So if you're going to do that, you have to get out of your left hemisphere. And people combine these things traditionally. So they'd eat well, they'd combine techniques to inhibit the left and simultaneously stimulate the right. And that was a big part of ancient tradition, because they recognized it was such a serious condition. We were losing who we were, and there was nothing more important. But the condition has progressed, unfortunately, to the point where we're not even aware we're in trouble neurologically. We think the problem's somewhere else. We don't pay attention to the basics. We build our neural system from rubbish. We're not even allowed, we're supposed to keep the chemical regime we have. We're prohibited from changing the chemical regime, even though the evidence suggests that we had a very, very complex chemical regime. It was flooded with plant biochemistry for millions of years. That's what it evolved to run on. But now we're supposed to run it on fish and chips, and if we dare do anything else, we get locked up. Even though the cultural output of a brain like this is self-destruction. It's like we're determined to destroy ourselves. And yet we know a lot about changing the chemical regime. And there is more research coming out now. It's finally being allowed again. That there's a lot of things we could do to start changing this. Yep.
Regarding the suppression of testosterone in an older male, that produces a lack of muscle tone. There's got to be a problem there with that.
Yeah, it is a little bit complex, and it's not necessarily about having no testosterone or lowering your testosterone. It's the environment it operates in. In fact, because testosterone is so important for reproduction, there's some evidence, and if you look at chimpanzees, bonobos, humans and so on, there's a scale of testosterone. We actually produce more testosterone than bonobos. They produce a bit less than chimpanzees and so on. And I think because this mechanism, as it ran away with itself, reproduction was actually quite difficult. And that's a pretty lethal thing to deal with. If you can't reproduce, the whole thing's over. So I think there was selection pressure to up our testosterone, and it is a very important chemical, but it was always in a modified environment. That's how it's supposed to operate. So it's when you lose the operating system, that's when it's troublesome. So it's not about suppressing the amount of testosterone, it's suppressing its activity. You can have a lot of testosterone as long as it's carefully modulated. So yes, I take your point. It's not about getting rid of the testosterone, it's making sure it operates in a certain environment.
Would you say that people from a culture, from a vegan type culture then, would be more right-brained than left-brained, or would they be more sort of stable?
Well,
what do you think?
I don't know of any vegan cultures. I know it's sort of making a comeback.
Like Jainism and things like that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's possible to eat complete rubbish vegan vegetarian diet. You know, it's got to be quality as well as being plant-based. But if it's good quality, it won't overcome the hormonal retardation of our left hemisphere, but it will potentiate things. So there will be some effect. It will have some impact. But it's not suggesting as today we can just switch, we can turn all this around with diet. I think diet's an absolute foundation, but we're going to need other things as well. It's the combination that really works.
It's taken, 200 million years or whatever?
It's taken a long time to cycle down, but the positive thing, and as I say, I'm focused on diagnosis at the minute. What really excites me is how we treat it, which I haven't got to, although I talk about it a bit in the book. Right. Although I'm talking about quite long time scales for this kind of cycling down, because it's epigenetic, because it's how we read the DNA, in principle, if we get the biochemistry right during early development, this can be turned around very quickly. It's not we've got another 200,000 years, forget it. Yeah. We're talking about a small number of generations. Yeah. Possible to make a huge difference in one generation. Because it's creating the environment. If we created the environment that was...
Is that assuming that you can get back to eating the types of fruits and vegetables and things that were in the forest in the first place, which may no longer exist anymore?
Yeah, particularly with the climatic drying, that is a factor. However, first of all, I'd say there probably were specific and key species in the African forest, particularly the non-seasonal forest. It's the only place this can occur is the non-seasonal forest. The rest of the forest is seasonal, so you can eat fruit. You can eat fruit here. You can eat it in the seasonal forest, but the only place you can eat it 24/7 is a non-seasonal forest, which is a tiny niche. And in terms of species that may have gone missing, yes, that is interesting, and it is possible. But fruit has a lot of generic qualities. There's good qualities in berries you'd eat in the northern hemisphere. So the angiosperm reproductive organ has a lot of generic qualities. I would expect there were some specific species that were relevant. They may or may not still exist. I haven't found it easy to find much information on these non-seasonal African species. There's a little bit coming out of the bonobo research because they're studying bonobos, what they eat, but there's not a lot of data. But I wouldn't be too worried about that. I would think a broad spectrum of tropical fruits is going to be 95% of the chemistry you need. But again, what I'm not advocating is saying, all right, we just have to go away and eat fruit now. We no longer have a specialized neuroassimilation system that's specialized for eating fruit. Our gut biome, the gut flora has changed massively. It's not the same anymore. So you have to take steps back towards it. Doing it too quickly all at once can actually cause a lot of problems. But at the same time, without that, I don't think our brain's ever going to work properly again. It's just going to continually spiral out of control. Yeah, basically. Yep.
A couple of slides back, the numbers were like 98%, 95%, 98% reduction in the parts of the brain that we used to have. I don't see many people walking around with there are probably if you really look at it, not being able to function because the brains have been developing, as far as I'm aware, for 100 million years, 200 million years. Because man apparently has been on, the archaeological evidence says that man has been here for not 4 million years like we taught in the school textbooks, but 100 million years. That's an awful long time to develop a human brain. how can we just suddenly take a quick dive?
Well,
As you said.
I'm not. I can't comment on those figures. I know there are all sorts of theories. I'm still working within the parameters of millions of years and then a 200,000 window.
Do you believe that man has been here for much longer than 4.5 million years?
I've not seen enough evidence for that myself. Yeah.
Undeniable.
Well, even if that were the case, the figures I was talking about, they weren't about loss of brain. They were a loss of the unique chemistry that was part of our diet. So those figures were about what we've lost in terms of the build materials, the design materials. Again, talking about a complex system, if that's what it was originally built from, then that's what we've lost.
So where does you haven't mentioned the corpus callosum then, where does that come in? Because that's supposed to connect. I'm leaving here tonight with a sort of, I might be naive, a sort of notion that I hate this part. Well, this is the part that I like because it makes me make my music and draw my painting.
Yeah.
I've often thought as an artist and a musician that I work from this side.
Yeah.
I've said it in the classroom. If you're artistic, and it's probably not based on much of my background because I'm not a scientist, but I said the right brain is supposed to be the creative brain and the left one is supposed to be the scientific one, the rational one, the one that likes order,
Yep.
and it's the nasty brain that these psychopaths have got. We've got the right brain.
Yeah.
It's what we have been brought up to believe.
Well,
I have anyway.
it's a little bit.
What about this connection between the two, the corpus callosum? Where does that work?
Well, remember, what I'm basically saying, and again, there's never enough time to go into all the detail in one of these sessions, but I'm saying originally, going back to this forest idea, we had two virtually identical hemispheres with phenomenal capacity that worked as a single whole. That's how they did work then. And really what we have now, that all I'm saying is the left hemisphere is a degenerate version of the right, and the corpus callosum was part of the structure and has been forever. So that was a normal part of how they work together. Now it's partly used by the left hemisphere to suppress the right. That's kind of how it works now, because the left hemisphere can run on anything. It's like a primitive brain now. It'll well, you've seen what we can eat now. The right hemisphere still has these high specs. It will only run really well on complex biochemistry. I suppose what I'm saying is that the left hemisphere isn't evil. It isn't a psychopath. It's just a very damaged version of the right. That's all.
Am I right in saying there are examples in history of people having half the brain missing?
Yep.
Or blown away in war?
Sometimes taken out by surgery. Yeah.
And they've not hardly been affected at all by it.
Well, it's a measure of how dominant our left hemisphere is. That if you have your right hemisphere damaged or taken out, it doesn't lead to a lot of obvious change. There's a lot of subtle clues when they do specific experiments, but it's a kind of demonstration of how dominant our left hemisphere is. There's not a lot of observable change, which is really interesting. If it's done the other way on, then there can be big changes. But looking at the examples of Savant syndrome, and there's a form of Savant syndrome, it's kind of instant Savant syndrome, where somebody's had an accident and within days or weeks, some phenomenal skills of, artists, one of them, but others as well, phenomenal memory, math skills, whatever. And I've never yet, in all the trawling I've done, I've never found a case where the right hemisphere has been damaged and it's released abilities in the left. There's nothing else there. It's already maxed out. Sometimes there's no clear evidence, but wherever there's evidence, it's always damage to the left. It fails, it can't keep control, and you get a release in the right, and oh my God, it's amazing. So it's always that way on. A lot of powerful clues there.
So what is meditation mainly aiming at the left hemisphere?
It's mainly, I think it's mainly about, because the left hemisphere has very little, in my opinion, very little perceptual function, other than what I'm doing now, hence the endless chattering and so on. By taking that away from it, it almost dims itself down. If you can just keep it calm, it's sort of, the lights go down, and then it allows you access to this otherness. And with practice, it gets better and better. Some people have a natural affinity for it. Some people it takes a long time. But yeah, meditation's one of the classic approaches. I think because our condition is so serious now, I think meditation was probably vastly more effective 10,000 years ago because the condition wasn't so bad. You know, we're now putting sticky plasters on a carnage site. We need much more powerful approaches now. But meditation, definitely, that's what it does. It calms the left hemisphere, allows the right hemisphere to start working a bit. I actually think most of what we experience, even in those states, is still like a glimpse of what's really possible. You know, I think that the ages of man mythology talks about 4 or 5 different ages, and each one was a severe crash following on a severe crash, and we're at the wrong end of that. And I think even when we get glimpses now, whether it's through psychedelic use or meditation, that's all it is. It's glimpses. You know,
You can make that last question, Jason.
Yeah, the big one for me is where are we going from here? Because a lot of this has been looking back at the formation to where we are now. What about forward? I mean, the fact is that very soon, I believe anyway, and I know a lot of people here do, that we've been bathed in very, very strong radiation and wireless frequency, RF, and it's going to literally rewire the brain. How do you view that?
I think there's a lot and increasing layers of damage we're doing to ourselves, and I'm talking collectively now, I'm not isolating governments. I'm just saying as a species, it's self-harm, it's self-destructive harm. And yes, there's a lot of recent layers, but that's the behaviour of a psychopathic, self-destructive being, really. I think all those things we could choose to stop tomorrow. I think the real problem is if this is all driven by a problem in our perception, which the ancient traditions tell us that's what was going wrong. You know, we've got this oral tradition saying there's something going wrong here, trying to warn us almost and giving us some techniques and so on. If that's the problem, and if it's possible to make a case that we've got a damaged brain, if that's not enough to get us to stop and readdress everything we're doing, I don't know what is. Because I think targeting these, like you're talking about radiation or whatever the hell it is, I don't deny any of that, but I think these are later insults to an already serious condition. And we're not going to be able to stop that unless we can generically stop the underlying. That's why I'm interested in the underlying cause. Why would individuals or governments or countries behave like this? Are they a totally separate species? Do they just have this condition more serious than average? Because there is a spectrum. It's like the autistic spectrum. You know, at one end, there's still people retain degrees of access, and they're generally more empathic, more chilled. They don't want to be in control, which is a shame. And then at the other end, you've got people with a much more severely damaged left hemisphere. They're much more frightened. They need control. They tend to get into power, and then inflict more problems. So I accept that goes on, but I don't think that's the cause. I think we're looking at these are just further symptoms, as it were.
We have to finish now.
Right.
This is a very quick one.
Yeah, rapid, absolutely.
Rapid fire. Which
10
sounds like a
seconds.
brain I engage then. So what would you consider the main advantages of taking the supplement 5-HTP?
I'm not an expert on that in particular. I've tried it in the past. I think there's more effective approaches, and I'm wary of talking about any supplements without it being a holistic approach. I think unless, if we've lost 5,000 or 10,000 chemicals, putting 1 or 2 back may or may not help things, but we really need the whole package back, and probably supplements on top of that. I'm talking about a very serious condition here. I know I've kind of made a few jokes and maybe not, but I think we're talking about serious neurological problem here, and we need that kind of response. And a single supplement here, yes, they might help, but really you need the whole package. You need to be stepping back, putting in the complex biochemistry, putting the techniques together that can make use of that chemistry, and probably elements in as well. It's so serious. I mean, look at what we're doing. We're hell-bent on destroying ourselves. So to me, it's not tweaking a little thing here or changing a little thing there. It's a wholesale radical change. In the same way that if anybody was unfortunate enough to have a serious accident, they cracked the skull, there's brain damage, we wouldn't be putting a sticky plaster on it. They'd be rushed to intensive care, and every resource would be made available. That's where I think we're at collectively.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Wright.
Thank you.